Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to this third day of the course and the second and unfortunately last day with Hans. Today, today I have a special announcement because we have to wish a happy birthday to Professor Michele Frepaz. IPROMO birthday. It's the first time we can celebrate his birthday during the course.
Thanks a lot, Danilo. It was not necessary, but okay.
you have to expect it.
Yeah, I'm almost 20 years old, you know.
Yes, yeah. More or less. Yeah. The problem is the measurement error, I know, but
doesn't matter. More or less.
Okay. Let's go on. Let's go on and start the lecture about climate change and mountain watershed management by Professor Hans Schreier. So Hans, please.
Greetings and happy birthday.
Thanks a lot, thanks.
Okay, so today we're going to cover, first of all, mountain tourism, water and climate change, and then we talk a little bit about hydropower. Then I want to show you something which might be of interest to all of you, looking at collaboration, and I'll show you an example of the Himalayan Andean project. And then we're going to talk a bit about virtual water, which a lot of you probably don't have heard about. And then finally, I'll finish with how do we do water conservation for people. So today, the first session is on tourism. So when you look at urbanization in mountains, we actually have two types of urbanization. We have a number of cities in very high elevation, which are urbanizing very rapidly. And what I'm showing you here is all of the cities which are at very high elevation and the number of people in these. So this is the elevation and this is the number of people. So you can see in some places like La Paz, these big cities live at 4,500 meters or 4,000 meters. So we say about 400 million people live above 1,500 meters. And as you go higher, of course, it gets smaller, but it's a substantial amount. So the one thing we need to look at is urbanization in mountains. The second thing, of course, we have to look at is tourism, because you will be totally surprised to find how many people actually go into the mountains at the temporary basis, and that means accommodation, which is again urbanization. So here's La Paz relying on the glacier for their drinking water, and here's the Mont Blanc where everybody wants to go climbing. So if you look at global tourism in general, last year about 1.5 billion people arrived as tourists in the world. That's about 70% of the global population. And of course, this year, I don't know what's going to happen because we won't have very many. But it's projected that once the virus is under control, that we might have about 1.8 billion people going into cities. And this is showing you when they are going for tourism. The blue is 2016, the green is 17, and the red is now, or last year. And you can see about 100 million people now go in the wintertime, and about 150 go in the summertime. But that means this is total tourism and doesn't necessarily mean mountain tourism. So if you look at mountain tourism and looking at where are people actually going, you will see that in Europe, we had about 700 million people arriving in the different destinations. And Europe is really exceeding any other area. And if you look at where people go in terms of destination, you see France, Spain, Italy, and so on. Most of them are the mountain countries. So if you look at global tourism in mountains, we figure about 15 to 20% of all the global tourism is in mountains. And it employs about 50 million people, which is huge. And we have roughly about almost 6,000 mountain resorts. These are, there are lots more, but these are the main resort areas. We have about 400 million skiers, and we've got massive amounts of infrastructure to maintain all these skiable slopes. And it, of course, employs a lot of people and so on. So why is tourism so water intensive? Well, the first thing is when you go skiing, you want to have good snow. And now what is happening because of climate change, you want to make snow, and making snow is incredibly water intensive and very energy intensive. And I'll show you later on what that means. Even if you go hiking, you create all kinds of problems with water, because if you have that many people going all to the same place, you're going to have water pollution, you're going to have litter, you're going to have pathogens, nutrient problems, and so on. A lot of people in the summer go for golfing, and I will show you golfing is one of the most water-intensive activity you can possibly imagine. And then, of course, mountain biking is now something, because what happens in mountains is if you cannot open your mountain resort in the summer and in the winter, it's very difficult to actually make it economically. So a lot of people are pushing mountain biking, and mountain biking is creating all kinds of new problems, specifically related to sediments and turbidity. And then, of course, swimming is a big activity in mountains, not only outdoor swimming, but I will show you the big advertisement now is spas and health activities, and that's heavy very water intensive. So let's look at the European Alps, where you all are supposed to be this year, and I want to show you how important this mountain range is for tourism around the world. And it is actually a very good example, because the Alpine region is the most developed area for tourism anywhere in the world. If you look at the European Alps, they receive somewhere between 60 and 70 million people a year in 600 some resorts. And you can see where the skiers come from. A total of about 49 million people come for skiing or arriving for skiing. And so here are the other parts. So if you look at mountain tourism and the importance of the European Alps, these are the number of resorts in the world: in the Americas in blue, in Asia Pacific in green, in red the European Alps, and the rest of Europe and Asia. And you can see in terms of percent of mountain tourism or resorts, in terms of visitors and in terms of ski operations, they're about almost a half of all the tourism is happening in the European Alps. That means we are urbanizing the mountain areas, and we're changing the landscape. Because of climate change, we're now trying to make snow to make sure we can open for Christmas in order to actually make it economically. If you cannot open the skiing season at Christmas time, all the economists are telling me that it's not economically viable. So let's look at some of the economic issues and say, well, we need at least 100 to 120 days of secure snow for skiing, and it has to be open at Christmas. Tourism for is a little bit more variable and more diverse, so that's not that much of an issue. So summer activities are basically hiking, climbing, mountain biking, swimming, paragliding, and sightseeing and golf. In the winter time, of course, it's all skiing related. And in order to attract all these urbanites who have no experience in mountains, they obviously organize conferences and festivals and spas and everything else. But what is most interesting to me is how did tourism develop in the European Alps? Well, it started in the 1850s because there was a lot of tuberculosis in the industrial part of Europe. And so the only cure at the time was going to the high mountains for recovery of tuberculosis. So that meant they built all these big sanitariums, which are big infrastructures. And then when they had a cure for tuberculosis, then the first mountain climbers came in, and they're continuing to come. And then skiing started about 1920, then hiking and golf started in the 50s, mountain biking much more recently. And guess what? We're now going back to the health issue because now the biggest attraction is wellness centers, spas, and health-related activities. So we have made a 180-degree shift from health to health. And so keep that in mind because that kind of change means more water demand. So just to show you basically the infrastructure which is being developed, you can see the intensification here in terms of densification and urbanization. And what I'm showing you here is, this is for Switzerland for different, no, this is for different resorts in the world. This is in the US and this is in Switzerland. And you can see summer and winter are almost the same for these resorts. So these are very viable resorts because they can attract most summer and winter tourists. So what have we done in the past? We built all kinds of infrastructure to protect for too much snow. Those are all kind of obstruction to hold the snow back so it doesn't damage everything downstream. And guess what we're doing now? We're protecting the landscape because we don't have enough snow by making snow. So we've gone from protection of too much to protection for too little. So just to give you an idea, I just took one of these examples. Look at the infrastructure which we have created in mountains to maintain skiing. You see all these activities, and I'll show you the details on that. Have you ever thought about, in your city where you live, how many people you can move by the public transport in 1 hour? So you look at your bus system in Rome or anywhere else and see how many people per hour can they actually move. If you look at the ski areas, they can move in Davos 27,000 people in 1 hour in all the ski lifts. And if you go to some of the French resorts, we're talking about 150,000 people which can be moved per hour. That is even bigger than what we get in urban centers. So what has happened to the landscape? This is a traditional village which was built in the 1800s and 1900s. And then tourism came and everybody wants to have their chalet. And then if you don't have good land use planning, this is the kind of problems which you're going to create. And so let's look at Switzerland. They have about 150 ski resorts. They have about 3,400 kilometers, about 2,800 million trails. They have all kinds of mountains and lakes. And the total population of the country is about 8 million, but they get about 21 million tourists. And obviously, this is a huge thing from an economic point of view. So they rely very heavily on tourism, and most of it is in the mountains. So if you look at the main big resorts in Switzerland, this is the type of elevation they operate in. These are the number of lifts which they do. These are the number of ski runs, and this is the length of the ski runs. So if you look at this, the total trail network is 65,000 kilometers. the distance across Canada is 6,000 kilometers. So you compare that. Canada is the second biggest country, and if I go from where I live on the west coast to the east coast, it's about 6,000 kilometers. We have trails in Switzerland of 65,000 kilometers. And these trails are like roads. They're changing the landscape. And a lot of the trails are obviously paved. And obviously because people want to have a clean environment, which is not very good. So let me show you probably the most incredible thing which came to my mind when I started to look at what happens in mountains. What I'm showing you here is the north face, the Eiger mountain. And in 1890 and 1900s, they started to build a railway which goes up from the resort area all the way into the mountains on top. And that is now called the top of the Alps, which means from a tourist point of view, you want to go to the top of the mountain range so that you get a beautiful view of the glaciers. So in 2018, the latest number I could get, 1 million people took the railway to get to the top. And what is even more interesting is the Swiss set up a climate station there very early on, so they have a long climate record. And they set up a CO2 station and started to monitoring this in the 60s. And then 2 years ago, they decided they would put another station up about 1 kilometer or 2 away from the railway station on top to get into a more natural environment. And so they have now 1.5 years of comparable data between the old station and the new station. And they found a slight difference in the CO2 where the old station was slightly higher than the new station. And nobody could explain it until somebody said, wait a second, all these tourists come up here and they smoke. And even the smoke from the tourists actually affect the CO2. It's incredible what this means. The other thing which is quite frustrating to me is how they advertise the top of the mountains. Some years ago, they had Roger Federer and Serena Williams, the big tennis players, play a tennis match on the glacier. And 2 years ago, they got the best golfers to have a golfing match on just to advertise the top of the mountains. This to me is total insanity, but that's what tourism and advertisement is all about. So let's have a quick look at the temperatures. Remember, the temperatures I showed you in the high mountains are increasing much faster than in the lowland. So if you look at the current accumulation of snow from September till August, so you can see that from November till about March is when you get a lot of the snow accumulation, and that obviously depends on the elevation. And then if you look at the modeling, this is how the snow accumulation is going to change. The red is being in the future, and the yellow is currently. So I did this in my part of the mountains in the Columbia Basin, in Golden, which is one of these communities which has a good ski area. And you can see in the past, in the 60s and 70s, we got lots of snow, and now we're down to about here. And the future looks like it might be pretty much stable in this part of the world because we are in a kind of a Pacific impacted zone. So the OADC in Paris did some assessment and said, how many tourist areas in the Alps are at what elevation? So these are the elevation ranges where the tourist resorts are. And they said right now about 1,400 meters is about the limit. Below that, you might not be able to have enough snow in order to do that. And as, of course, it's getting warmer and warmer, you have to move up in elevation. So those tourist areas which are at low elevation, they might not be viable in the future. Only the ones which are very high in elevation will be able to operate in the next 30 years. So if you look at the 666 main ski resorts in the Alps, if there is a 1 degree increase, which is obviously going to happen, this is going to go down to 500, and it's projected that it might actually go down to 200 if we have a 4 degree increase. So you can see the changes which are going to happen to winter tourism. For those of you who can't read this, this means snow security for sure. In other words, they are advertising and telling you, we have secure snow conditions in our resort. This is what they make sure to attract the people who like to ski. And this is not just one area, here is another area. This is also called snow secure. This town is snow secure. And they have all these kind of different types of snow guns to make snow. And this is obviously going to be a real issue as we go on with climate change. So snowmaking is an interesting thing because snowmaking requires lots of water. I was just showing you here, it takes somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 cubic meters per hectare to make about 30 centimeters of snow. And this means about a half a cubic meter per square meter of snow. And if you look at the cost of these snow guns, they can be anywhere between $6,000 and $30,000 per gun. And they operate about 120 hours per year. And you need temperatures roughly by -4. You can actually even make snow at -1 and -2, but it's getting much more difficult once it gets to 0. So the way you blow the water into the snow gun and you throw it into the landscape is very, very inefficient. We say that somewhere between 10 and 40% of all the water which is being blown through the system sublimates. It doesn't even, it just goes back into the atmosphere. So the amount of water that is needed is equivalent to irrigating a crop of corn per hectare. So we're looking at something like agriculture. And the energy requirements are huge. And that means we need to build all the energy infrastructure in the mountains, which will then compete with the energy demand from the lowland. So you can see the snowmaking is a big business and a very, very water intensive and energy intensive activity. So the major ski resorts in the US, example, it just shows you domestic water use by, this particular ski resort has a domestic water use of about 100,000 people. So we're talking urbanization for skiing demand, which is equivalent to cities. And the energy consumption is similar. So if you look at who is making snow, and apparently in the recent data, about a third of all the ski resorts make snow in the Swiss Alps. In Austria, it's 70%. In Italy, apparently it's 80%. And in France, about 60%. And as it gets warmer, people will try more and more to make snow. Unfortunately, you can't experience this, but this is in the Dolomites. This is usually where we have our field trip. So for those of you who didn't have the chance to go there, here's a picture of where we usually go for a trip. And what they did here is they built this lake. strictly for snowmaking. This is now the source of the water for snowmaking. And you can imagine, first of all, how much that costs. I think, if I remember correctly, and my Italian friends can probably correct me, I think it was about 2 million euros to build this reservoir or this lake just for snowmaking. Even more interesting is we're trying to stop all the snow and the ice from melting. So we have gone from trying to accumulate snow by fences to making snow to going to snow farming. So what we're doing now is actually farming of snow in the mountains. And you can see in this case here, they put plastic over the remaining part of the ice to make sure it doesn't melt as fast, or all these new kind of lakes and reservoirs so that you actually have water to make snow. So not only do we make snow, but we add all kinds of chemicals to make the snow. And the snow is actually very different when you make artificial snow from natural snow, because they add something like ammonium nitrate and calcium chloride to improve the quality and to harden the snow. And of course, they also use CO2 and liquid nitrogen to cool the area. And some of the these snow guns use different kinds of clay particles so that this will be the nucleus for snow accumulation. And also, some of them use a bacteria which apparently helps to crystallize the snow. So there is this other thing we need to be conscious about, because some of these things, like ammonium nitrate, that is a fertilizer. So if you apply all this to the snow and the snow melts, you're actually increasing the fertility of the stuff you grow. So in France now, they have all kinds of operations which are farming the snow. And what they do is they make the snow in the winter when it's cold enough. They pile it up, cover it either with sawdust or with plastic over the winter, over the summer, so that they can actually put it on their key places where the skiing starts for Christmas. So this is a totally new kind of activity, and you can see most of them use massive amounts of water. Where do they get this water from? Well, they get some of it from rivers, some of it from lakes, some of it from groundwater, some of it from springs. So wherever they can get the water, they're going to use it. And what is particularly important is, when do they need that water? So if you look at the river discharge, if you use the river as a source for snowmaking, typically what happens in many rivers, you get the peak discharge in the spring and summer, and in October, November, we're almost at the lowest part of the stream flow, and this is when they need the water. So we're not only impacting the amount of water, but we're impacting the whole ecosystem of the river system. So if you look at snow farming and impacts, you can see that, first of all, the water demand is going to increase dramatically because of snowmaking and storage. They're going to build storage, and they're going to need far more hydropower in order to maintain this. Because obviously the best source for making snow is using hydropower. So this is competing with the hydropower demand in the lowland. The second thing you need to consider is pollution, because if you add all these additives, you might create all kinds of pollution problems. You also will create soil erosion. And Michele, our chair, is probably one of the foremost experts who has looked at what happens to the soil when you start making snow, because you're trying to compact the snow to make it icy to last longer. And this has huge impacts on the soil conditions, and he will probably tell you more about it. He's the expert on all this. And then, of course, when you use all these snow guns, you're generating quite a lot of CO2, and it's going to change the whole water extraction business in rivers during the low flow period. And we need to start thinking about how do we maintain the environmental services in rivers when you extract more water at the critical time of the year. So in order to do this, we need all kinds of new infrastructure to protect against these new events which are going to happen. And Danilo probably can give you all the expertise on this. That's his expertise. And you can see the kind of problems in terms of infrastructure which they have to build in a very, very hazardous environment. This is quite precarious kind of conditions. And you can see the cost of trying to build all these infrastructures. So I'm showing you a very simple example of a Swiss resort on a lake. And you can see the mountain areas here. This is in 2003, and this is in 2009, after they had one of these big climatic events. And I want you to look at this part and that part and compare that with this. So they had this big storm event, and you should never, ever build a city on a fan. So here's the river basin coming down, and here is the alluvial fan. This is where, over the past, all the sediment has accumulated, and in all these alluvial fans, the river used to meander. Sometimes it would go here, sometimes it would go there. And in 2009, you can see it came right through here. And this is what happened. And then they obviously started to say, well, we need to protect all these houses, so we need to remove some of these houses to make more room if this happens again. So this is what they have done now in order to protect the rest, and they had to move houses. So you can see the kind of issues and problems which we are facing. So let me show you a study from my part of the world, Whistler Mountain. We had the Olympic Games in Whistler in 2010. This is the infrastructure which we created, and this is the kind of ski environment which we have. It's a very, very nice ski area for those of you who like skiing, including me. And what is really interesting to me is, in order to get the Olympics, they said, well, we have to be green. We have to show the world that we can actually be environmentally protective. And so they made kind of projections from in 2009 before they got the Olympics, and they got it in 2010, and they did it all the way to 2020, which is this year. So they made projections on what they're going to do to be environmentally green. So what I'm showing you here is the people who live there on a permanent basis to help with the infrastructure. So it's about, at the time of the Olympics, it was about 25,000, and now we're about 35,000 10 years later. So it's only a small increase. But I want you to see what happens with the tourism. So before the Olympics, we had about 2 million visitors a year. We now have about 3.5 million visitors a year. And the lift capacity is 70,000 people per hour. So they can lift people and move it to the slopes at an incredible rate. We have 200 ski runs, 1,600 vertical drops, 1,600 meters, 36 snowmaking guns, 4 golf courses, 250 kilometers biking trails, and the visitors are about equal winter and summer. So 3.5 million visitors now. So If you look at the projections after the Olympics in 2010, they said they wanted to reduce the water consumption, they wanted to use the energy consumption, reduce the landfill deposition, reduce the total CO2 emissions. So here is 2009, and then during the Olympics, they were able to actually reduce the landfill problem significantly. And then 1 year after, they did very well. It looked very good. And because of all this thing, you can see we have had an increase. And this is the target they set at the time of the Olympics. So we're way above the target for landfill. If you go now to the water use and to the energy use, you can see we're in a exactly similar situation. If you look at the total CO2 emissions, here is the Olympics. We did well for a few years, and now we're back up to where we were almost before the Olympics. And the target we haven't reached at all. What is even more interesting, there is actually a glacier in the headwaters of the Whistler Resort, and that means people can ski in the summer on the glacier. But the glacier is melting very, very fast. So what they're doing this year for the first time, they put up 4 snow guns to make snow for the glacier. In other words, they're thinking that by making snow, we can maintain the melting of the glacier, trying to compensate for glacial melt in the summer. I am questioning the economic viability, and again, this seems a desperate move trying to maintain economic activities in the mountains. So keep that in mind, just so that you know. And then also, summer tourism is becoming incredibly popular. And you can see this is in the Columbia Basin, all the biking trails which we now have, which is a very nice thing to do, but we have to be very careful how we maintain all these bike runs, because that has the potential to create all kinds of sediments. So they make it very attractive by building all these crazy contraptions so people can fly through the air. And that gets me to the golf courses. So in one of our driest watershed, we have something like 45 golf courses. And golf courses use more water than agriculture on a hectare basis. And if you look at, I looked at the size of the golf courses, so there are 45 golf courses here. And I looked at the size, some are very small, some are very large. This is the average area in hectares of golf courses, and this is the amount of water they use. And what is particularly interesting to me is they use, the average golf course uses about 180,000 cubic meters per year of water. And this is the most conservative recreational organization I know of, because they absolutely refuse to have non-green golf courses. If you look at, I am not a golfer, so I'm getting into trouble with all the golfing friends. But if you look at when golf was started in Scotland, they actually left the landscape natural except for the putting area. Well, try to tell them they should do this now, they absolutely refuse, because they say it has to be green, otherwise it is not competitive. So here is a situation in the driest watershed in Canada, where these are all the golf courses, and here is how much they irrigate. And then you need to look at what happens in this part is during a wet year and during a dry year. So in a dry year, the red part, you use far more water, and the difference is about a third. So if it's a very dry year, you use about a third more water than in a wet year, and this has to be considered now with climate change. So Danilo probably knows this better than me. This is the Mont Blanc, And what is particularly interesting to me is about 30,000 people try to go to the highest mountains in the Alps every year. That means about 400 people try to climb this mountain every day on average. 60% get sick and fall and fail to reach the peak. About 100 rescues by a year per helicopter. 500 kilograms of trash every week has to be removed. And of course, a lot of people are totally unprepared for these mountain environments. And for the first time, they're contemplating, they haven't yet, but they're contemplating of limiting the number of people which should go up there and that they are better prepared. So this is a new kind of thing which also affects all the water resources. So going back to the Himalayas where it started from, the first people who tried to climb the Himalayas in 1922, 23, and 24, the British expeditions, they didn't make it. But about 1950, we have now a reasonable record of people are trying to reach the head of Mount Everest. And what I'm showing you here is in red, the number of people who have succeeded in reaching the top of the world. And these in blue are the number of people who did not succeed. And if you look at the casualties, you can see the kind of problems. And you probably heard in the news last year the kind of disasters which are happening now because they're building all this infrastructure to help the people to get up there by building fences and ropes and ladders so that people can actually climb it. So if you look at how many people have actually succeeded, it's about 10,000 people. And about 24,000 have tried to reach this kind of thing. So when you look at this, tourism is a really interesting kind of conundrum because it huge impacts on the mountains. Yes, it's a good activity. Yes, it brings economics into the mountains, but it has a huge amount of side effects. So all of you in the rest of the world who are looking at tourism, be careful when you look at it to make sure that the water resources are actually under good control. And for those of you who don't know, you probably often have parkas and hats and everything, all the paraphernalia which you put on. Often there is a company called North Face. North Face, this is the Eiger mountain in Switzerland, and this is called the North Face because it's one of the most difficult mountain climbs. The Japanese, every equipment, which the Japanese love mountain climbing, and every equipment in Japan has to be tested at North Face to be certified that it's good. So this is where we are now in tourism, and hopefully that gives you some food for thought. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Hans. So we have already 2 questions and a half. Let's say it's a comment rather than a question. And okay, the first 2 are from Dana. The first one is, with all these numbers, it is even possible to have an ecotourism, or it is just a good idea?
Well, I think ecotourism is really a way to think about, because obviously you have at this, you got much more involvement of the local population. In these resort areas, the local population doesn't really play a role. It's all done by people come in to facilitate the facilities and so on. But ecotourism is actually a much more benign kind of thing, but you need to regulate the numbers. Because if we get into this urbanization where you got thousands of people coming, you know, even Venice in Italy now is saying we need to restrict the number of people who come in because we're now at the point where totally saturated, we can't cope. And so that's the difference between benign tourism and massive urbanized type of tourism.
Okay, another question from the same participant. She's interested in some prediction and in your opinion on how climate change will threaten Winter Olympics that that also involves Venice, and not Venice really, but the eastern part of Italy, because the next one should be there.
Well, what happened in our part of the world, one ski area, they actually moved the whole operation 1,000 meters higher for security. So yes, some of these high mountain areas, they will be viable in the future, but the cost of managing some of these Winter Olympics is going to be much more expensive, and you need to wonder whether we should actually curtail the Winter Olympics and have much less activities, which would make it much more viable. Because right now, with expanding all the activities for Olympics, I don't think that's a viable option for winter skiing.
Okay, many thanks. So there is a comment from Manas Dwivedi, said that in India, an artificial lake like the one you showed was constructed in Auli in Uttarakhand in India and was built by a company from Italy. I hope they've done a good job, because I feel quite responsible.
Well, you need to remember, if we start making more and more of these lakes, we are storing water and we're changing the way the river system works. And this is actually a good point for the next presentation, because remember, hydropower is the main source of energy in the mountains. And so there is competition now, not only from the lowland for this hydropower production, but competition from winter tourism.
Okay, there is a question from Alvaro. Okay, tourism, I try to sum up because it's quite long. Tourism is an activity with sustained growth over time, one of the safest and most profitable industries. So basically, the evidence is indicating the need to establish limits carrying capacity to tourism, but it is very difficult to go against the macroeconomic feature that support it. How do you see that?
Absolutely. You know, the real problem is tourism is one of the few economic viable activities in mountains, because what is happening anywhere in the world, people are moving out of the mountains, and those who want to stay there, they need some economic opportunities. And so tourism is actually one of the very attractive ways and can make a lot of money. But if it's just based on growth, and growth, we're getting to the point where we really need to regulate this. And this is a hard thing to actually do. People don't like to have controls and regulations unless you're in a dictatorship. And so, yeah, it's a real conundrum. You know, we need economic activities in mountains, and I would suggest we probably will have more people moving into mountains in the future because of climate change. You will see this probably in the Himalayas, because once it gets too hot, particularly in the summer, and I think this is already happening in Italy, if Rome gets too hot, fewer people will go to the beach and more people will go into the mountains. So this is a new form of tourism, which I don't think many people have thought about. Another thing, which might be another activity for permanent activities in mountains for economic purposes, is what we're doing right now, computing. Why is computing of interest in mountains? Well, all the servers who store all your information are incredibly energy intensive and create a huge amounts of heat. So what these big companies are doing, like Microsoft and Google, they are putting their servers at higher elevation to save energy because it's cooler and so on. And so I've been telling this our Italian friends already last year. What we should think about is, why don't we encourage some of these big computer companies to put their servers at higher elevation? That will bring in young people into the mountains, because it will need young people, because us old people don't understand how this system works to start with. But the young people will, and they will do all the work, which means that's a new form of permanent settlement and activity, which probably would be better than just encouraging tourism.
Okay, many thanks. I would like to add a comment about the tourism in mountain. This year, it was observed that was an enlargement of numbers of tourism in mountain due to the pandemic, because people did not trust, at least in Italy, the security of seaside.
Oh yeah, interesting. I didn't even know that. Wow.
And going to the question, there is a question from Sonigitu. Please kindly advise on better ways for snow farming, and what is the current impact of the chemical used in the snow farming?
Well, I think I will leave that to Michele, because he knows this better than me. So far, the impacts on the additives have not been so dramatic, but I don't think we have done enough work. And also the problem is, many of these new additives are very, very new. We haven't used them for very long, so we don't know what the long-term impacts are. But like I said, Michele will be much better prepared for answering that for you.
Yeah, if I could add something, Hans, and thanks a lot for the question, also for the very interesting presentation. I mean, this is a very big issue concerning the impact of artificial snowmaking on soils, vegetation, and also concerning the use of additives. Of course, we need to do more research on this topic. But now, according to my experience, we tested, for example, the impact of snow additives based on bacteria. There is an additive which is based on the use of Pseudomonas syringae, which is a natural occurring bacteria. And we found that, of course, it depends on the amount of the additive that you use. And also the quality and the characteristic of the soils of the ski runs where you apply it. So it's very difficult to have only one answer. I should say it depends. But of course, what is really important is to give the opportunity to researchers to test and to analyze the impact of this kind of additives on soils. Other thing is concerning the snow making and also the snow grooming. For example, you just said something about the changing density or snow density, which could affect the soil temperature. And so even if you use natural or artificial snow, doesn't matter, but you compacted it, you increase the density of the snow, you reduce the insulation capacity of the snow, and so the soil below is frozen. You can have effect on the nutrient cycling, on the vegetation. So it's a very, very big issue. And I just recommend on chat a book that we published a couple of years ago with some Swiss colleagues and other colleagues. It's an open access book, so it's completely free. And there you can find different chapters concerning the impact of ski management on different environmental aspects, soil, vegetation, animals. So it's a very wide spectrum on what we know by now on this very, very big topic. So thanks a lot, Hans, for this input. So we can also going on with the discussion, maybe also in the next days, also during my lecture on mountain soils. So thanks a lot.
Okay, so I think I'll switch and now go to hydropower. Second here.